There are moments in life when the world grows quiet, not because everything is fine, but because you are standing alone with your doubts. Moments when your strength feels borrowed, your courage feels thin, and the loudest voice you hear is the one questioning your worth. We all reach a point where the climb feels endless, and the ground beneath our confidence begins to slip. This is a story about that fragile space. About the subtle force of self-belief, the kind that doesn't shout, but endures. The kind that carries you forward when motivation fades and failure leaves its mark. This story will show you how true transformation begins not at the peak, but in the quiet decision to keep going. In a small mountain town, surrounded by cold air and towering silence, there lived a climber named Elias. Elias lived in a town where the mountains rose like silent judges, their peaks sharp against the sky, their shadows stretching into the valleys below. Every morning, before the sun softened the cold air, he stepped outside his small wooden cabin and looked up at them. They were beautiful, yes, but they were also reminders of how high the world expected him to climb. Of how small he sometimes felt beneath that expectation. To the people in town, Elias was known as disciplined, focused. The kind of man who woke before dawn and trained while others slept. They saw his steady pace on icy trails, the careful way he tied his ropes, the quiet seriousness in his eyes. What they didn't see was the weight he carried inside, the belief that his worth depended on reaching the top. For Elias, climbing was never just about the mountain. It was about becoming someone undeniable. Someone strong enough that doubt would finally leave him alone. Each step upward felt like a negotiation with his own fear. If he climbed higher, maybe he would matter more. If he endured enough pain, maybe he would earn peace. Inside his cabin, the walls were lined with old maps, faded photographs of peaks conquered and others still untouched. Each image felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. At night, when the wind pressed against the windows, Elias lay awake imagining himself standing at the summit, arms heavy, lungs burning, but finally certain of who he was. Yet beneath his discipline lived a quiet unrest. A subtle tremor he never spoke of. He feared that without the mountain, there would be nothing left to prove his strength. That if he ever stopped climbing, the silence would expose everything he had been running from. And so, Elias kept moving. Training harder. Dreaming bigger. Believing, perhaps too deeply, that the peak would give him what he could not yet give himself. And in that belief, the journey truly began. As winter loosened its grip on the valley, Elias's days fell into a strict, almost sacred rhythm. Before the first light touched the mountains, he was already moving, boots crunching against frost, breath rising in slow, steady clouds. Discipline was his language. Each morning's climb, each measured stretch of muscle, felt like a quiet vow to become stronger than yesterday. The mountain responded. Slowly at first. Trails that once left his legs trembling now felt familiar beneath his feet. His grip grew surer, his balance calmer. There were small victories, reaching ledges he once avoided, finishing climbs faster, standing higher above the valley than he ever had before. These moments filled him with a fragile warmth, something close to motivation, something that whispered, "You are becoming enough." Word spread through the town. Other climbers nodded at him with respect. A few even asked for advice. Elias accepted their admiration quietly, but inside, it fed a growing fire. Each compliment stitched itself into his sense of purpose. Each success became proof that his relentless effort was working. At night, he began planning a climb no one had attempted alone in years, a steep, unforgiving face of the mountain known for its sudden storms and narrow paths. The idea frightened him. And because it frightened him, it felt necessary. Courage, he believed, was not the absence of fear, but the ability to stand above it. Yet hidden within this rise was a subtle imbalance. Elias did not rest. He did not listen to the quiet signals of exhaustion or doubt. Failure had no place in his imagination. His self-belief, though growing, was tightly bound to performance. If he succeeded, he felt worthy. If he faltered, he felt nothing at all. Still, the higher he climbed, the lighter he felt. Purpose seemed close enough to touch. And in that rising confidence, Elias made a promise to himself, to reach the summit alone, and finally prove what he had always hoped was true. The mountain waited. Silent. Patient. The morning Elias chose for the climb arrived wrapped in false calm. The sky was clear, the air unusually still, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. He tightened his gloves, checked his ropes twice, and began the ascent alone. Each step felt deliberate, confident, earned through months of discipline and sacrifice. This was the moment he believed would define him. For hours, the climb went smoothly. His movements were precise, almost graceful. He ignored the ache in his arms, the tightness in his chest. Pain, he had learned, was just another obstacle to pass through. Higher and higher he went, until the valley below shrank into silence. Then, without warning, the mountain changed. A sudden shift in wind carried loose snow across the face. The rock beneath his foot gave way, not dramatically, but enough. Just enough. Elias felt the world tilt. His grip slipped, his balance faltered, and in that single breathless second, confidence turned into fear. The rope caught him before the fall became fatal. But it did not catch everything. Hanging there, suspended between sky and stone, Elias felt something break inside him. Not his body, his belief. The belief that discipline could control every outcome. That effort alone could protect him from failure. He climbed back down in silence, each movement heavy with shock. News travels fast in small towns. Whispers followed him through narrow streets. Some spoke of bad luck. Others of misjudgment. Elias heard none of it clearly. The loudest voice was his own, repeating a single question: if I couldn't do this, who am I? Nights grew longer. The maps on his walls felt distant, mocking. The photographs no longer inspired him, they accused him. He replayed the moment again and again, searching for the exact second where strength abandoned him. Failure had not taken his life. It had taken something more intimate, his certainty. And for the first time, the mountain did not feel like a goal. It felt like a reminder of everything he was afraid to face. After the fall, Elias did not leave town. But in many ways, he disappeared. Days passed without him touching the mountain. His boots remained by the door, untouched. His ropes hung loosely against the wall, collecting dust. Yet his mind never left that frozen moment on the rock face. He replayed it endlessly, every step, every breath, convinced that if he found the mistake, he could undo the pain. Instead of rest, he punished himself with rigid routines. Long runs before dawn. Endless repetitions of strength drills. Discipline, once a source of growth, became a shield against feeling. He told himself he was preparing to return stronger. But beneath that resolve lived fear, the kind that refuses to be named. Elias avoided the paths where other climbers trained. He could not bear their quiet glances, their careful silence. In his isolation, he clung to the memory of who he used to be. The man who never slipped. The man who always rose. Letting go of that version felt like admitting he had lost more than a climb. At night, guilt pressed in like the cold. He blamed himself for trusting the weather, for pushing too far, for believing too much. His thoughts circled the same question without mercy: why wasn't I enough? The mountain still stood outside his window, unchanged. But Elias could no longer look at it without feeling small. He convinced himself that the answer was simple: train harder, ignore the doubt, return as if nothing had happened. Acceptance felt like surrender. And surrender, he believed, was weakness. So he stayed frozen between past and future. Too wounded to move forward. Too proud to step back. In that stillness, time stretched. And the quiet grew heavier. Elias did not realize it yet, but denial was not protecting him. It was slowly teaching him how far he had drifted from himself. And sometimes, it is in that quiet suffering that truth begins to look for a way in. One late afternoon, when the light hung low and soft against the mountains, Elias walked farther than he had in weeks. Not upward, just along the lower trail where the air felt gentler and the ground more forgiving. He told himself he was only stretching his legs. But something in him was tired of walls and silence. Near an old resting point, he noticed a man sitting on a worn wooden bench. The stranger was older, his back slightly curved, his hands steady despite their age. No ropes lay beside him. No gear. Just a thermos resting at his feet and a quiet ease in his posture. Elias would have passed without stopping, but the man spoke first. "Still beautiful, even when we're not climbing it," he said, eyes fixed on the peaks. Elias hesitated, then sat at the far end of the bench. They watched the mountain together for a while, sharing a silence that felt different, lighter. "I used to chase the summits," the old man continued, as if reading Elias's thoughts. "Thought reaching the top would make me whole." Elias felt a familiar tightening in his chest. "And did it?" The man smiled, not sadly, not proudly. Just honestly. "For a moment. Then I learned something quieter." He turned to Elias. "The mountain doesn't test your strength. It reveals what you believe about yourself." Those words settled slowly. Elias said nothing. "I stopped climbing when I learned I didn't need to prove I belonged up there," the man added. "Belief doesn't come from winning. It comes from staying kind to yourself when you don't." The wind moved through the trees. Elias felt something shift, small, but real. No advice had ever sounded like that. No command. No correction. Just truth offered gently, without demand. As they parted, the old man left Elias with one final thought. "Some climbs are meant to be finished," he said. "Others are meant to be understood." Elias walked home under a darkening sky, carrying a question instead of a burden. And for the first time since the fall, that felt like progress. The next morning did not feel miraculous. There was no surge of motivation, no sudden clarity. Elias woke the same way he had for weeks, quiet, uncertain, carrying the residue of doubt. But something had softened. The weight in his chest was no longer pressing as hard. He returned to the mountain slowly. Not to conquer it. Just to walk beside it. Instead of measuring progress by height or speed, Elias began paying attention to smaller things, the rhythm of his breath, the steadiness of his steps, the way sunlight filtered through the trees. He stopped when his body asked him to. He turned back without guilt. For the first time, discipline was guided by care, not punishment. There were days he didn't climb at all. Days he sat with his thoughts and let them pass without argument. He allowed the memory of the fall to exist without rewriting it. Failure, he realized, did not need to be defeated. It needed to be understood. Gradually, something within him began to rebuild. A quieter form of strength. One that did not demand applause or certainty. His self-belief no longer rested on reaching a peak, it rested on showing up honestly, even when confidence wavered. Elias practiced letting go. Of the man he thought he had to be. Of the timeline he had imposed on himself. He forgave the version of himself that slipped. Not because it was easy, but because holding on to blame had cost him peace. Weeks passed. Then months. The mountain remained unchanged, but Elias was not the same man who once stood beneath it with clenched fists and borrowed courage. Rebirth did not arrive as a dramatic moment. It arrived as acceptance. As patience. As the quiet realization that transformation does not shout, it whispers. And in that whisper, Elias felt something he had chased for years. Not triumph. Peace. When Elias returned to the higher trails, it was without an audience. No announcement. No expectation. The morning was pale and calm, the kind that asks for presence, not proof. He moved with an ease that surprised him, not because the climb was easier, but because he was no longer fighting himself. Each step felt intentional, grounded. He rested when needed. Adjusted when conditions changed. The mountain no longer felt like a judge. It felt like a companion, silent, vast, indifferent to outcomes. And somehow, that indifference was freeing. Elias did not rush toward the summit. He allowed the journey to unfold. Along the way, he noticed things he once ignored, the way clouds cast slow-moving shadows across the rock, the sound of wind humming between narrow passages. He realized that courage was not pushing forward at all costs. Courage was listening, adapting, trusting himself enough to stop or continue without fear. When he finally reached a high ridge, he paused. Not because it marked a victory, but because it felt complete. He stood there, breathing steadily, aware of both his strength and his limits. And for the first time, those two truths did not compete. Purpose no longer came from standing above the world. It came from standing within it, whole, present, unafraid of falling again. Elias understood now that self-belief was not a loud declaration. It was a steady companion, shaped by discipline, humility, and forgiveness. As he descended, he felt light. Not because he had conquered the mountain, but because he had released the need to. The town below looked the same. The peak still loomed high. But Elias carried something new inside him, a calm certainty that did not depend on success. A new dawn is not always marked by sunrise. Sometimes, it is marked by peace. Perhaps this story feels familiar. Because somewhere in your own journey, you have stood where Elias once stood, measuring your worth by outcomes, mistaking discipline for self-punishment, believing that strength only counts when it wins. And like him, you may have learned the hard way that failure does not ask for permission before it arrives. Here are the quiet lessons this mountain leaves behind. First, remembering this, failure is not the opposite of strength. It is often where strength is shaped. Second, self-belief is not loud. It grows in silence, in patience, in the decision to return gently after falling. Third, discipline should serve your healing, not your shame. When effort is driven by self-respect, it becomes sustainable. Fourth, letting go is not giving up. It is releasing the version of yourself that no longer fits who you are becoming. Fifth, courage is listening. To your limits. To your truth. To the quiet voice that asks you to slow down. Sixth, purpose is not found at the peak. It is discovered along the journey, in how you treat yourself on the way. And finally, rebirth does not arrive dramatically. It arrives as peace, steady, earned, and deeply human. If this story spoke to you, carry it forward. Share it with someone still climbing in silence. And if you want more stories like this, stories about motivation, healing, transformation, and the quiet strength of believing in yourself, stay with us. Because your journey is not over. And the next step, no matter how small, still counts.